ವಸಂತ್ ತಿಂತೆ ಬಾ.
ಇವ್ರು ಡ್ರೋನ್ ಅದು ಕ್ಯಾಂಡಿಡೇಟ್ಸ್ ಗಡೆಗಟ್ಟಲೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಬಿಡಿ.
ತೊಳಿ ತೊಳಿ ತೊಳಿ.
ಮುಂದೆ ಬಾ, ಇನ್ನು ನಾನು 24 ಐತಿ.
ಅಯ್ಯ ಅವನು ಮುಂದೆ ಬಾ ಅಂತಾನೆ ಬ್ರೋ. ಬ್ರೋ ಹಿಂದೆ ಬನ್ನಿ, ಹಿಂದೆ ಬನ್ನಿ, ಬನ್ನಿ ಹಿಂದೆ. ಬ್ರೋ ಬನ್ನಿ, ಹಿಂದೆ ಬನ್ನಿ. ತೊಳಿ, ಇಲ್ಲಿನೇ ತೊಳಿ, ಕೊಡ ತೊಳಿ. ಓಕೆ ಮ್ಯಾಮ್, ಸ್ಟ್ರೈಟ್ ನೋಡಿ, ಸ್ಮೈಲ್.
ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ರೈಟ್ ಕೊಡಿ.
ಬ್ರೋ ಸರ್, ಆರ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿ.
Project manager?
Yes, 15 years of experience.
Do you have any AI certifications?
No, but
When you need to hustle without hassle, it matters where you stay. Hilton for the stay.
Project manager?
yes, 15 years of experience.
Do you have any AI certifications?
No, but
You said you're just looking at sofas.
But now you're just sofa hopping like it's the Olympics. Cute, but I'm in the mood to explore more. Ooh, now this is dangerous. I don't think I'll be leaving this spot anytime soon. Style plus comfort, rare combo. Feels like Pinterest came alive here. Okay, I think we have a winner. 11 on 10. High quality fabric and extremely durable. This looks luxurious and feels so comforting. And oh, this also comes with a 3-year warranty period. Okay, someone bring me a snack because I live here now. So come by Sleepyhead Furniture Store.
సియా దీనికి యష్ హెల్ప్ తీసుకో.
చెడిపోయేషా.
Ask him nicely.
సింపుల్ మూమెంట్స్ ని అందమైన ఇన్వైట్స్ గా మార్చేయండి. Canva హృదయం నుండి రూపకల్పనకు.
Only 29 rupees. 6 days Vedic Maths Summer Camp. Don't calculate in a slow way. Enroll course and master top speed method. You can solve the questions in seconds. Attention dear parents. If your child is studying in class 1 to 10, join course now. Only 29 rupees today. Includes 50 plus maths top tricks, 50 plus science core concepts. Come and learn with teachers from IIT NIT. Super discount is ending soon. Only 29 rupees today. Enroll now.
चैट जीपीटी सीखना है, आ जाओ सिखा दूंगा। प्रेजेंटेशन 2 मिनट में बनाना है, आ जाओ।
Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories. And I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we welcome back to the show acclaimed horror filmmaker Lee Cronin, along with his sound designer and supervising sound editor, Peter Albrechtsen. We had a really fun conversation with these guys when they joined us back in 2023 in Austin, Texas, at Dolby House at South by Southwest. We talked about their work on Evil Dead Rise, which had just premiered the night before. Now they're back on Dolby Creator Talks with their new delightfully gore horror fest. I'm talking, of course, about Lee Cronin's The Mummy. If you've seen the film, then you already know it is graphic, and that's some of the fun of these kind of movies. But if you haven't seen it and you're squeamish, be forewarned. You might never be able to get a pedicure without thinking about this movie. And while we're on the subject of content warnings, we've done our best to avoid major spoilers, but there's really no way to discuss this film without giving away some of the more fun scares and surprises. So if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to hit pause and check it out now as it's currently in theaters, which is really the ideal place to watch a movie like this. Trust me, the audience reactions are incredible. I wanted to start today's conversation by asking Lee about his decision to take on another iconic horror franchise after having had such a success with Evil Dead Rise. Here's writer and director Lee Cronin.
The unknowns, in a lot of ways, was very appealing to me. I was a fan from childhood of the Evil Dead movies and always harbored a certain ambition to, if given the opportunity to make one. Especially when I never thought they'd do more with them, but then when Fede made his movie in 2013, I thought, oh, I'd love to have a go at one of those. And so in entering that, like, I always view everything I make, even if it's connected to something that's come before, it's my own movie, it's my own world, and you treat it that way. But the Mummy was interesting to me because it wasn't something I had a burning ambition or desire. And I tend to react a little bit to what I've done before, and try and pivot in some way. And although this movie has my style in terms of how I approach gore and horror, it wasn't like I have a wall full of Mummy DVDs of all these different iterations over the years. I know the movies as well as anybody that loves genre full stop, but they weren't necessarily it wasn't, and that interested me. I was like, okay, that's a challenge where I'm not, it's not that I'm not a fan, that sounds too dramatic, but I'm not like, I'm not completely versed with this world, and I wanted to take on something that maybe wasn't in my DNA as much, and the opportunity then to subvert expectations and tell a story in a different way using some familiar motifs and kind of concepts was super appealing to me.
You guys collaborated so successfully on Evil Dead Rise. So at what point did you draw Peter into the process and start to like think about the sound design for what The Mummy could possibly be?
Pretty early. We should go back in our messages and find out when. I know when we finished Evil Dead, I was toying with a couple of other projects as well. So I know I'd often ring Peter, and just be like, look, because if you're working with people that are great in their roles, brilliant HODs, you do want to make them aware of what you're trying to do from early, because they might become unavailable. So you want to have some bait on the hook and keep them engaged. So I know we talked about another project or two, but then I guess, it was kind of around release weekend of Evil Dead Rise, which was 3 years ago. It was April 2023, just before the writer's strike. I closed a deal for The Mummy, and then I sat on it, obviously, because of the strike.
Oh, because you couldn't write.
Yeah. So it kind of sat there for a little while, which wasn't the worst thing in the world in terms of I just finished promoting a film. So got a moment to catch my breath. And then I had some competing projects, and it was probably around, I wrote the script for The Mummy at the start of 2024. And I guess I would have made Peter aware I was working on this, but I guess I probably shared the first draft with you, Peter, right? Even in all of its roughness, I probably gave you insight into what it was.
Yeah, we have this constant communication, so it's really brilliant to read Lee's scripts because they are filled with sound. I mean, I'm always telling Lee that I get so inspired by the way he writes his scripts because there's so much sound written into the script. And already from the first drafts, this again was a story with a lot of focus on sound.
I wanted to ask you about that because, Lee, you remember you joined us at Dolby House at South by Southwest.
It was great. I remember it well. I still rate the flask that you gave us that day has been rated as one of the best insulated flasks of all time. Just to put that out there, it's still in use.
It's the little things that make a big difference. But I remember when we had that conversation. I think it was so crazy because I think it was the day after your premiere.
I think so. Yeah.
We had that conversation. You talked about obviously how important the sound design is to the film, but you talked about being aware and thinking about sound as you were writing the script. So I wanted to ask you about that. What were you thinking about in terms of the sound design and what you were going to task Peter with as you were writing The Mummy?
I think it's always part of the design, because the way that I write, there's a couple of different things that are relevant. So the first thing is certainly as I've developed my own style over time, no action description goes above 2 lines. So it's very, very tuned, the screenplay. But within that as well, the other thing within that world that I sometimes break form with would be describing sound maybe in like a singular word or a rhythm. So it's a rhythmic thing for me. And why I'm talking about these little couplets that I write is that's also just part of the structure. I'm kind of directing it. I know people say don't direct on the page, but if you're a writer-director, you're writing to direct it. I'm creating this blueprint. And within that blueprint, I always want there to be some sort of word-based engagement with how I hear the movie as much as what I'm explaining that I see. But I think a lot of the sound that I would write in is, again, quite in relation to rhythmic stuff, and trying to use words to describe sound that might also play a part in tension. So like I could get caught up in the real specificity of like click, 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 or bang, 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 and thinking about how many there should be. Now that chops and changes, you shoot the movie, you go into sound design or whatever, but the intent is there from really early on to try and give an impression of what that sound is going to do to a scene or to a particular sequence.
Peter, what was your reaction to reading that first draft of the script? Was there anything you remember that you were particularly excited about, or were there any kind of like, oh my God, how am I going to pull this off?
I mean, I really loved the scope and the ambition of it. I remember, Lee, you were saying like, this is a very different beast, Peter. Yeah. And it is, like, in the way that it just where Evil Dead Rise was like one location, one day and night, like it was like very kind of limited in that way. Then this film has a wide scope, like both geographically, time-wise, character-wise. There's, of course, it's still, the focus is on this family, but there's also a detective story going on, and the amount of environments that we go throughout the film is vast. So there's a lot of things to work on. And when I read Lee's scripts, I see them almost like a grocery list, like, oh, okay, so I need to get hold of that sound and that sound and that sound. So it's just amazing to be part of it so early, because then I get this library of sounds that I then pass on to the picture editor, Brian Shaw, so that he has sounds to work with from the beginning.
It's interesting because this movie, every experience is different, and I love the edit. I love when I get into the offline and start to work. I actually found the edit on this one quite stressful, because the film was quite large and ambitious, and we had a very, very long assembly, but actually we would have been in big trouble without early sound in it, because of the way it was written and the nature of it and how the tension needed to be built. At times it was quite hard to find the shape of scenes without sound that was very, very clear in its signposting of where we were heading ultimately. Sometimes you're cutting something and you can just dig into a bit of a library, but quite early on we actually needed design to help us craft the sequences.
So Peter, does that mean so you were working on some specific sequences and handing stuff off to the picture department? I did have a question for you, Lee, that like, were there any specific sequences that like just were not coming together in the edit until you started to hear some of the sound come together for them?
Do you know what was interesting actually, Glenn, was that it wasn't the sequences you think wouldn't work. It was sometimes actually some of the things that were more everyday that we were struggling a little bit to find a personality for, and always wanting to have something within the movie that's a constant reminder you're in a horror film. So sometimes it was even atmospherics and textural stuff. Like there's a scene in the movie with there's a couple of scenes with Morse code, but there's one involving Morse code with teeth. And it actually cut really well without us having to have the bespoke sound there. Got way better when we put the sound actually in. But even actually, there's one scene where it's a dialogue scene between Charlie Caan and the dad. He's sitting in an home office at night in New Mexico, and he's talking to this cop Zaki, and she's over in Cairo in the daytime, and she moves him inside her office to outside her office. And even it was really hard to know if we had the rhythm of because when you shoot a scene like that, I write it and go, I'll be on this character for this line, and I write it that way, but I would naturally shoot a bit, more broadly, that I wouldn't grab one line and go, cut, I'm definitely not going to use that. You shoot the scene both sides. So there was a lot of opportunity there, and I remember feeling, until quite late in the edit, until we actually had the right atmos and feeling, it was actually hard to know if the game of ping pong between the two characters was right. So it wasn't always about, the obvious, like we need bang, bang, bangs and the thump of a door. You can have things that are indicative, but sometimes it was tonal stuff, because these sort of scenes really relied on the bringing together of both the performance and the visual, but the atmosphere as well.
So I started out on the film, like, I think a week after Brian Shaw started the picture editing. Like, Brian was like, Peter, you need to do sounds for these things, otherwise I can't edit the movie. So I started doing these sketches very, very early on, and then just sending things over, and then sharing that with Brian in stems so he could split things out. And kind of sometimes Brian did amazing things with just like taking something that wasn't like at one place and then putting it into another place. And Lee and Brian are so creative with that. And for me, it's about kind of like putting a lot of sound into their kind of toolbox, so it becomes a part of the kind of the creative storytelling of the film.
I'm really glad that you guys have brought this up, because I had a note to myself that, I mean, obviously there's some big set pieces in the film, and we'll talk about those moments, but I love the way you guys use sound just to kind of contribute to mood and tone and, texture, as you say. Lee, there was, I made a note to myself. So when I watch these movies, like I'm just scrawling in my little notebook, and I can barely read it afterwards. But there's a scene where right after they get Katie back to the house in Albuquerque, where they're taking her up the stairs in her wheelchair, and it was so present. It was such an interesting way to use sound in that moment, and I just wrote in my little notebook, going up the stairs, it was like, Peter went a little crazy here. It was such a great moment. Because in that way, you're telling the audience, like, it's this kind of mundane thing that's happening, but the way you use sound is unsettling to the audience, and you're telling them, like, you just get this sense of like some bad shit's going to go down.
Yeah. I think with something like that, like, I quite like exaggeration in those areas, because I think it does create a tension. Because on the one hand, now it's not every day that you bring home a daughter and bring her up the stairs in a wheelchair, but there's lots of people that, for a variety of reasons might be dealing with someone that's disabled in their home, or an elderly person or whatever. And I just wanted to take that kind of moment and really push it and be quite expressive. It's a really good example of sound in the script, because I would have written each clunk, like a clunk of the wheels. But one of the things it's one of those things, funny, it was very clear in my mind, and we never got it the way I wrote it, but it's better the way we ended up, was that I always wanted you to hear this banging ka-clunk as a pre-lap over the scene beforehand. That's how I'd written it. So we're on Katie's face in the car, and then you'd hear da-dunk, 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 and then you'd cut to the wheelchair. But for two reasons. One, when we cut in, I needed her to, the way the set was designed, I didn't have enough steps on the first rise to get enough clunks before I cut to the image. These are the interesting things. I thought, you'd hear bang, 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 then we'll cut in and I can have another 5 of these. But actually, if I use bangs on the pre-lap, by the time I cut to the picture, she'd be up the first part of the stairs, so I can't visually tell that story. Funny, the little things that hem you in, all based on a design. And the design was right, but it has an impact on what we're doing when we're editing. It has an impact on what we're doing with sound design. But then also, the way we built tension in the scene that I didn't originally envisage the pre-lap playing out was much more interesting to actually sit with that moment and the awkwardness, because it builds up to like the grandmother Carmen saying, hey, let me see my granddaughter, and we cut inside the car. It's now not the outside atmosphere, we're inside the car. It feels kind of heavy. She's just breathing. They open the door. there's a little tiny music riser, there's a bit of reactions, and then you come straight, and it's a hard cut into bang, that first kind of clunk. But yeah, I think scenes like that, I do like to be just quite expressive, and like I'm not technically proficient in how Peter and his team do their create the witchcraft that they do, but I know how I want to use those tools that they have. So to me, from a sonic point of view, I'm like, I want lots of close-ups. Even if I'm a little bit wider potentially, I still want the sound to be expressive, like I'm playing that as a close-up. Even if I drop a little wider, I want to get in your head with these effects.
And it's also a way of like establishing already there that, I mean, this tiny girl is actually like, there's a lot of weight in there. There's something in there that's just not, this is not just a tiny little girl. And I really loved that moment for that as well. And like the transition, I think that, I mean, in this film, we did so many transitions with sound that kind of like you start in the previous scene and then you go into the next scene through the sound. And this is like one of these places where like I have this backwards kind of reversed effect of the first hit of the wheelchair, like coming in early, so it kind of sucks you into that next scene. And we do a lot of those things throughout the film, all the time, kind of like playing around with the transitions, and that kind of also makes the storytelling like constantly kind of like, it gives a pace and an energy, but also it gives a dynamic.
And there's a lot of scenes in the movie. We needed to use a lot of tricks. There's a lot of scenes.
I want to follow up something on Lee, you were just talking about, because I made a note when I was watching the movie that like you use close-ups in a really interesting way to give detail and texture to a space. And it creates all these really interesting opportunities for Peter on sound design. So, I mean, is that something that you're consciously thinking about as you're shooting, to like, I want to grab this to kind of create some opportunities for that? Or what? Just tell me about that part of the process, because it's so interesting to me that like visually you're setting up all these cues for great sound.
I think it's kind of instinctive. Like it's as I said, it's there from the script and it's there from early conversations, definitely. But within the design of the scenes visually and then the shooting, which always deviates a little bit from the plans and you're reacting, I'm just always looking for opportunities to refresh the experience. And in a way, I think all of these close-ups and perspectives, like that scene, for example, where they bring up the stairs, brings us into a really interesting scene right afterwards where she's going to bed for being put into bed for the first time. And in some respects, if you just stood back and analyze, you're like, okay, family gather around a bed. There's some close-ups. There's a moment of impact. There's a stunt. You know, there's a supernatural weight that kind of kicks in. But man, like just shooting that scene, there were so many moments and so many things required. And I think even from a sound point of view, then Peter, that was, you know, quite a challenging one to find. It's one that you have to talk about in the wild a lot, where you're envisaging things that are going to take a lot of effort and time to even put into practice to then know if they work really, really well. But it was, yeah. And I guess I am always thinking about, in some respects, what's the job of this shot? And sometimes it doesn't need a sound to denote it. It's not like every moment we go, hey, we cut to a cool close-up, so let's go. But if there's a chance to enhance or to further strengthen the concept behind what I'm showing you, then we're usually all over that.
I love that scene where they put Katie in bed for the first time, and Peter, you had a great moment there, you know, where we go into Katie's POV and we hear what she's hearing, and it's muted and distorted and just it's very unsettling. And then of course her grandmother speaks Spanish to her, and I feel like that triggers a memory of the magician speaking to her. And then kind of there's this very visceral moment where she reacts to that. So talk to me, Peter, a little bit about crafting that sequence, because there's a lot going on from a sound design perspective in a very short period of time.
It took a lot of work. I mean, Garrett Farrell, who was supervising the dialogue and mixing the dialogue and music, I mean, me and him, we built up this really like this shorthand when we were doing Evil Dead Rise. Like we are really into playing around creatively with dialogue, and And it took a lot of like going back and forth of like how much treatment could we have on the voice and still make it intelligible, and kind of like how much of perspective change should we have, and all of this, and kept on developing throughout the process. I mean, it was something we started out working on in like when for some of the previews, and then it just kept on being refined until the very last moment. And it's really interesting because it's I mean, sometimes when you have a script writer sitting with you who has written all the words down, and then the scriptwriter can become very focused on like, okay, I want to hear every word. But the amazing thing working with Lee is also like, okay, the important thing is also like getting the feeling across. So we can do these treatments, and then like there's specific things we need to hear, but we can also use dialogue as a sound design element, which is amazing for a scene like that.
Tell me a little bit about, your approach to the vocalizations and the sound of Katie, because I love the textures of her breathing and her vocalizations when they first get her back to the house in Albuquerque. But then I feel like as the film progresses and the demon becomes, more of a front and center part of her character, we go on an acoustic journey with her voice, obviously, and the way you're handling her mouth, just her breathing sounds. So talk to me a little bit about that process of figuring out what she was going to sound like, and also kind of mapping out what the journey for that would be.
That was something that took a lot of work. Natalie Grace, who's playing Katie, was just amazing. I mean, just from a physical point of view, like I think she did all her own stunts, Lee, and
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, there's always moments where there's help required, but she was like, I want to do everything as much as is possible. So yeah, she delivered.
Her performance was just amazing. So then when we got to the ADR, I remember Garrett and I sitting there for the first ADR session, and like in comes this tiny girl, and kind of we were saying, okay, can you maybe make some kind of horrific kind of noises, some really raspy breathing and stuff like that? And she, yes, of course. And she just started going crazy, and she made so many great sounds. I think she did 3 ADR sessions just with like kind of demon voices, and it was really amazing how like the backbone of the voice of Katie is really her performance. But then on top of that, I remember, Lee, you were talking about very early on that you wanted a male voice in there. So we did we recorded some, and we wanted some Arabic in there. So we recorded a couple of Arabic voice actors where like Lee wrote down some curses that we got translated into Arabic, and that was like, so we recorded those in Arabic, and then Bob Keller, who was sound effects editor, who really like tuned in on Katie's voice also, like he was sitting there like going through that material and finding parts of the Arabic that somehow fit with the English that Katie was saying, so that like her voice becomes like a part of like the kind of the core of it is Natalie Grace's voice, but then within that is all these Arabic things that, I mean, just parts of sentences and words that are put into her lines. And then on top of that, there's all the breathings and efforts, which like she did some of that, but it was also, again, like cutting in and out of her breathings and a lot of animalistic things. We even had Lee's dog in there that for like some of the press, the licking of the floor. That's Lee's dog.
This is like a 4-pound chihuahua, by the way.
Close mic'd.
You give her some peanut butter, she'll make all the noises in the world.
So it's a mixture of a lot of different elements, but you're right that it was important to have that kind of trajectory throughout the film where the voice really develops.
Peter, I know that you've been influenced in your sound design by the work of Randy Tom, who we both know quite well. And Randy, has obviously written at length about this idea of how to design a movie for sound, and to use sound as a storytelling tool. And one of the ideas that I've always been struck by that he talks about, and Lee, you were just talking about this a minute ago, is the idea of using the visual and the production design of the film to create these opportunities for sound. And I feel like I could teach a class on using your film, because you've got such a great example of this, Lee, in these, the house in Albuquerque. You designed it with these crazy, insane crawl spaces, between the walls and then between the floors. And that just opens up so many possibilities for extraordinary sound design. I'm thinking about that sequence with Sebastian and Maud, where they're hearing Katie in the walls moving around the house. And obviously, I'm delighted by that, because it's an amazing moment in Dolby Atmos as well. So, I mean, where did that idea come from to kind of create